for today is 1 Peter 4, verse 5 through 7. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. But the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. I guess you could say that this verse reminds us of the necessity and the expediency of the gospel, that we need to have the gospel preached so that people can be ready to face Jesus in the last judgment. Let's begin by looking at the text. Peter begins by saying, they will give an account. Now, to understand who they are, we need to back up to the previous verses. And as we do, I want you to take notice of a couple of underlined words here in this text. We begin in verse 18 of chapter 3, where Peter says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit." The contrast is clearly that Jesus was made alive, but he had been put to death. And also, it's important to note here in this context that the idea of suffering here is not just suffering in general, but suffering to the point of being put to death. This is consistent through the rest of this text. If you notice in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Therefore Christ suffered for us in the flesh." And that suffering in the flesh is being put to death in the flesh. Again, the equivalency is that suffering in this context is being put to death in the flesh. And so Peter reminds his readers to arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he, that is the reader that he's talking to, who has suffered in the flesh, or having been put to death in the flesh, has ceased from sin. And the point that Peter is making is that the only final resolution to our sin problem is to be put to death. That is, whenever we die, we no longer have the sin problem. It is dealt with. We are finally removed not only from the very presence of sin, but also from the power of sin that may be in our lives. And then he goes on and says that he no longer should live. The he here in this text is the same one referred to in verse 1, that he tells them to arm yourselves and be ready with the same mind, because the only one who has suffered in the flesh or died is the one who has ceased from sin. So he says in verse 2 that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. There is another contrast in here that is important for the rest of our text that we will consider today, and that is this, that there is the flesh and there is the spirit. There is the one who lives in the flesh and the one who lives for the will of God. And the contrast is clear. In verse 3 he says, "For we have spent enough of our pastime doing the will of the Gentiles," which is another way of saying the will of the flesh, "when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they," that is the Gentiles, "think it strange that you do not run with them with the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you." Now, with that context, we turn back to our text. So the they is the group of Gentiles that think it strange that you do not run with them with the same sin any longer. And the reason why is because you have been changed, you have been regenerated, and now you have the Spirit of God in your life. So he says that they, the Gentiles, will give an account to him. This is a reminder of the sobering judgment that will come upon all of those in the world who have ever lived. In fact, he says that they will give an account. The Greek word translated here, "will give an account," is two words, apodidomi and logon. The word logon, or logos, we get it from, is a word or statement. And will give, it's an idea of basically saying this, that you will give a word. You will have to make a statement on your behalf to him. Actually, the Greek text says to the one. The word him is not there. It's just assuming that we understand from context that it is Christ. So the Gentile unbelievers will actually have to give a word of their life or a statement of their life to him. And then Peter says, who is ready to judge? Who is ready to judge? The word translated ready here is a word that means already prepared, ready to meet the challenge. As one translation says, he is standing ready to judge. All preparations have been made to judge you. And then Peter reminds us that the ones that will be judged are the living and the dead. And the point is that it doesn't matter whether you're alive now or that you've already died. There's no way to escape the judgment. The living are the ones that are alive at the time Peter's writing, and the dead are the ones who have already died. So the point is, whether you're alive or dead, you will be brought before him and you will be judged. Verse 6 says now, for this reason, what reason? The reason that you will give an account to him. For this reason, the gospel was preached to those who are dead. Now, this verse has created a great deal of confusion because some have thought, in what way did the gospel get preached to those who are dead? There have been three primary interpretations of this over time. Some believe that this refers to the preaching of the dead in the sense that they are spiritually dead. Like the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1 and following, that we are dead in our trespasses and sins, that we are spiritually dead, so that the gospel has been preached to those who were spiritually dead. The other interpretation has been is that perhaps maybe that Jesus went and preached to the spirits in prison, as an earlier verse says in chapter 3, and that the spirits in prison were those that have died and their spirits are down there and they're getting an opportunity to hear the gospel, if you will, for a second chance. William Barclay, in his commentary, believes this to be the case. However, the problem with that is that there is no second chance. Whenever you die, you don't get an opportunity to hear the gospel again and then repent, if you will, in hell. That is not a biblical doctrine at all. It does not square with the rest of Scripture. So we can rule that one out right away. And then the other one is perhaps maybe that what he's talking about is that the ones who have already died, like in the case in the earlier verse where it says the living and the dead. Well, we know that the dead here refer to the physically dead, the ones who have already died. So this here would also be those who are physically dead, that is, those who have already died. I think another important argument here is this, is that the word translated here, preached, is the Greek word euangelizo. We get the word evangelize or evangelical. It simply means to preach the gospel. That's where the word comes from in this text. The entire translation of gospel was preached is the word euangelizo. Earlier in the text in 1 Peter chapter 3, where it talks about that Jesus descended and preached to the spirits in prison, he's not talking about euangelizo. He uses the Greek word keruso, to proclaim or to herald. And many believe it basically means that he heralded a victory. He did not go to preach the gospel to the spirits in prison. Rather, he went and heralded a victory to those spirits in prison. And in this text, in verse 6, it says, for this reason the gospel was preached, or euangelizo, evangelized. So this is referring to the gospel, the good news being shared with those who are in need of salvation. He says also that this was done, and this is the word that, for the purpose that they might be judged according to men in the flesh. Now this refers to the reality that in the context of the suffering for Christ, as these Christians were under great intense persecution, that although they might be judged according to men, and that is in reference to men and their own judgment, and sometimes even put to death, persecuted to the point of death, they would still live according to God in the Spirit. The contrast is they are judged by men, evaluated by men in the flesh, that is, as we are living here in these bodies, and sometimes they are suffering to the point of physical death, but they will still live according to God in the Spirit. That is, they will live forever and ever spiritually. So the reason why the gospel is preached is because those who have died might live according to God in the Spirit, although they have been put to death or suffered in the flesh. One last phrase here in this text is, but the end of all things is at hand. And I believe what Peter is referring to is the consummation of all things, that is, the return of Christ and the completion of everything. The translation of the Greek word end is the word telos. It means completion or reaching the end or consummation, often referring to the end of time. He says, but the end of all things is at hand. And that is a very familiar phrase to those who read the New Testament because they know that the word is at hand is often used. Jesus said on a number of occasions, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This is the Greek word engidzo. It's used 14 times in the perfect tense in the New Testament, and it always means in the context, it is close, it is imminent. There's an extreme closeness that is referring to this. So that is also an eschatological term that is used often in the New Testament to refer to the coming of Christ and the consummation of all things. And what Peter has in mind in its context is, since he's referred to the account that everyone will give to Jesus Christ because he is ready to judge the living and the dead, that the end of all things refers to that event. And so the emphasis is so clear in this text that the reason why the gospel needs to be preached is because all of those who have even died would be able to live. Although they are killed or put to death or suffering in the flesh, according to men, because they have believed the gospel of Christ, they will live. They will continue to live in the Spirit, according to God. One last admonition is given to us by Peter at the end of verse 7, which says, therefore, be serious. That's a command. The Greek word is sophroneo. It means to have safety in mind or self-control, sober-minded. It comes from sous, which means safe, and phren, which means that which regulates life. So Peter's calling on us and commanding us to be of sober-mindedness, be prepared, be of self-control. And then he says, be watchful. The word watchful is the Greek word nepho. And it's an aorist imperative also, which means it is a command. And that word actually is used often of not being drunk or being sober. But it came to refer to, in a spiritual sense, of clarity of mind, not influenced by anything inside or outside of you other than the Spirit of God. So we are to be serious-minded, sober-minded, safety-minded, of self-control, and also alert in our minds. That's the idea translated here, watchful, clear-minded in your prayers. Why? Because we are going to face him one day, and we will give an account of ourselves to him, whether we are alive or whether we are dead. We're going to face him and face judgment. For this reason, the gospel was preached. John Wesley said, of the necessity of the gospel, untold millions are still untold. And that is the word for today.